Welcome to the Duce podcast, a podcast on change and legacies in Italy. I'm your host Diego. In our third episode of the series, we will cover fascist totalitarianism, the strong state, and continuity within the fascist political system. As the morning dawned on the 4th of January 1925, doors were busted down and people dragged into the streets. Hundreds were arrested and many more were killed, beaten, and sent into confino, or eternal exile, to Italy's many islands. Over the next year or so, any Italians who dare oppose a fascist regime would feel the force of a word muttered by Mussolini in one of his many speeches: totalitarianism. The word and its interpretation would go on to impact not only the structure of the Italian state, but also the very meaning of fascism itself. Fascism and the state would be dominant. Yet, the institutions of old held on. The monarchy, army, police, and even the Senate laboured on as organs of the fascist organism, but remained relatively unchanged. A contradiction to the very essence of totalitarianism. The seemingly fascist state was not so fascist after all. This is not a story about change, but rather continuity. A continuity that had far-reaching consequences not only for the regime, but for Republican Italy as well. Although Mussolini first used the term totalitarian in a speech in June 1925, the spectre of totalitarianism had long cast its shadow over the ideology. From the very first Squadristi, fascism had always tended towards complete domination of all sections of society. The Squadristi were determined to not only defeat the opposition but also annihilate it. There would be no compromise. This was the fascist crusade, and they would not rest until the enemy was purged. Only then could the nation be reformed, and as Dino Grandi, a prominent figure in the fascist regime, put it, make the masses adhere to the national state. Fascism has always been hard to define, but I personally believe that fascism is an ideology that focuses on the group, its needs and its priorities above all else. In fascist Italy, the group was a nation. Every single Italian would be part of this national fasci. Nothing could be allowed to exist outside this fasci or group. This is why fascism never really focused heavily on class issues. To them, class issues only divided Italians into smaller groups, undermining the greater national group. Fascism promised to promote national unity and bring an end to Italian internal strife. Individuals would only find self-realization for unity with fascism and the nation. To reach this goal, the fascist regime needed to not only destroy the opposition, but also fascisticize Italians. Fascism needed to make Italians and mold them. Fascism would be a total conception of life, a concept we'll explore in more detail in later episodes. To many in the fascist movement, the only entity able to achieve this totalitarian goal was the state. The state was not neutral, but instead acted as an ethical authority, a guiding hand for the Italian people. The state also needed to be strong, a bulwark against any who dared to poison the Italian people with any fanciful ideas of individualism. However, like everything with fascism, everyone had different interpretations of the role of the state. The radicals wanted fascism moving towards a position in which the state itself would become indistinguishable from the party in the PNF. Legal Italy would be morphed with real Italy. This process would have required, as one can guess, the complete fascist takeover of all fascist institutions through purges. The PNF would become the revolutionary vanguard, keeping the fires of revolution alive through violence and bloodshed. The monarch would have to fall. Radical fascism was deeply republican, and the monarchy and the House of Savoy represented everything the radicals hated, being a figurehead of a decadent Italy. This was party totalitarianism at its purest. This clashed heavily with the view of statist interventionism. This rejected the view that the party would become the state and infiltrate Italian society, instead argued that this would be achieved through the state's overwhelming power. According to Alfredo Rocco, an ex-nationalist politician who had a deep impact on fascism, the state would follow an idealized model of a wartime government. Italian society would be in a state of total mobilization under the watchful eye of an all-powerful and sovereign state, which regulated, coordinated, institutionalized, or organized groups into serving the interests of the nation. Mussolini, already embedded into the establishment, swayed heavily towards this statist totalitarianism. As he stated, everything would be in the state with nothing being outside or against it. Mussolini's definition of the state, however, was himself. He invented a new position for himself as head of government, which was only accountable to the king. This was the start of a process of centralization of power to Mussolini. The Grand Council, made a state organ in 1928, was supposed to foster debate and designate candidates to fill vacant ministerial posts, but this power remained potential rather than reality. Mussolini retained most of the powers and handed himself ministerial posts. The regime that Mussolini envisioned was more of a personal regime rather than a truly fascist one. In fact, Mussolini helped to depoliticize the regime. The regime was not necessarily seen as a regime of fascism, but rather one of the cult of Mussolini. The regime did not find its unifying element in a common enemy, but rather in Mussolini himself. The The organisational energy of the regime was fixated constantly on Mussolini and his cult. This carried on to such an extent that Mussolini became permanently detached from fascism. This type of regime was extremely inefficient. Mussolini delegated most of the work to under-secretaries, but often intervened. He was intensely suspicious of anyone who gained too much power, which explains why Italo Balbo, the relatively successful Marshal of the Air Force, was fired and sent to Libya, where he couldn't be a threat. It also undermined the attempts of the fascist regime to embed themselves in society. The regime was undermined by Mussolini, who stole all the attention and averted any anger towards the party officials. As discussed earlier, one of the pillars of totalitarianism in the state was the total monopoly of power. This required the total destruction of the opposition. This was achieved with brutal efficiency. The process began with the censorship of the press. Industrialists who knew they couldn't quarrel with the regime owned the major newspapers. Offending editors were quickly removed in smooth, quick and ruthless manners. Podestas, local mayors with full executive and legislative powers, replaced local mayors. Opposition parties oppressed by violence and cut off from the press and elections withered away quickly. The last bastion of the opposition, the Senate, which couldn't be purged without challenging the king's authority, was powerless, as Mussolini soon consolidated power. In 1926, all opposition parties were banned as the mandate of opposition had run out, an obvious excuse. The police was used extensively as well. Their activities between 1925 and 26 was on a much larger scale than had ever been seen before. It carried out over 20,000 visits and thousands of arrests. Between 1922 and 1943, 5,000 political prisoners were imprisoned, with 10,000 more sent to the confino. Yet the most effective tool was Ovra. Founded in 1926, Ovra was the fascist secret police, recruiting vast networks of secret inspectors and sitting outside the public policy and security authorities. It created a Cancelliaro Politico Centrale, or the Central Political Filing Registry, which housed information on every potential opponent to the regime. This, combined with a thick web of spies and informants, made most opposition completely ineffective. Italians were terrified of saying anything remotely anti-fascist in the fears of being heard. The police thus played a large role in promoting the totalitarian state and destroying the opposition. Yet, despite the police's key role in the regime, with the head of the police between 1926 and 1940 being called the true architect of the regime, the police remained largely in traditional hands. Arturo Buccini, the head of police, was a career prefect, and by no means an ardent fascist. Buccini was intensely suspicious of fascists and prevented any attempts to create a rival political police force under the PNF. Italy would have no equivalent of the SS until the dying years of the regime in Salò. The courts and judiciary didn't really change either. The Penal Code of 1931 was far from fascists, and judges simply joined the PNF for job security and continued on with their lives. The only real innovation was the creation of the Special Tribune for the Defense of the State, run by the militia and presided over by military law. One of the pillars of the regime was thus a continuity from the past. The police oppression that was so integral to fascist totalitarianism was not a fascist oppression, but an oppression of old institutions used by an increasingly powerful state. This continuity undermined fascist claim to totalitarianism, and more importantly reflects how much the party in the regime had moderated, and how far it had embedded itself into the Italian establishment. While the fascists did certainly achieve a strong state, it is clear that the state was not necessarily a fascist one. The continuity in the police was certainly significant, but two other institutions remained very powerful in the Italian state: the monarchy and the civil service. It is easy to forget that fascist Italy was a monarchy, with Vittorio Emanuele III as king. The king didn't have much power in fascist Italy. He signed most decrees and in 1928 reluctantly agreed to give extra powers to the fascist Grand Council. He also supported Mussolini's assertive foreign policy decisions, and by the 1930s he had largely retired from public affairs and had virtually abdicated in all but name. Yet, despite this, the monarchy's influence was considerable. The flag of fascist Italy had been defaced with the coat of arms of the House of Savoy, as it had been for the last 80 years, and the kings resisted any attempts to put fascist symbols onto the flag. The existence of the monarchy also served to ensure largely non-fascist armed forces. The armed forces wore allegiance to the king, and not Mussolini, and the army refused to use a fascist salute. The branches of the military were also referred to as the Regia Marina, the Royal Navy, the Regia Aeronautica, the Royal Air Force. The Air Force's planes flew into battle, emblazoned with the fasces on the wing, and the coat of arms of Savoy emblazoned on the tail. A metaphor for the peculiar coexistence of the supposedly anti-establishment fascist party and the monarchy. The monarchy also ensured the Carabinieri, a paramilitary police, remained loyal to the monarch rather than fascism. The monarchy and the army proved an external set of symbols, ideas and hierarchies to fascism. These were old institutions, with the House of Savoy being over 1,000 years old. They had their own traditions that existed outside of fascism and its totalitarian ideals. Thus, fascism and its stream of monopolies of power immediately dealt a blow due to the continuity of the monarchy. Another important institution that lived on was the civil service. Mussolini's much vaunted purge of the bureaucrats was actually very limited. Civil servants usually kept to their old practices, but with fewer checks and balances. Senior members of the service held on to top jobs, even in typically fascist ministries such as the ministries of corporations. The civil service provided the regime with a non-political permanent executive which wouldn't threaten Mussolini. Even the most political branches of the civil service, the prefects, who oversaw provincial life, were mostly career civil servants. Between 1922 and 1929, only 26 out of the 89 new prefects came from outside the civil service. The prefects were needed to oppress Quadrismo and control provincial fascists. They were the men in charge, and not the local party secretary. The prefects also chose the local podesta or mayor, which, as you can guess, often led to favoritism and corruption. It also led to the traditional elite regaining control of local government, especially in southern Italy. The civil service was also used extensively by the regime to employ needy fascists as a form of patronage and social control. The civil service swelled in numbers, a process made even greater by the creation of parastatal agencies during the Great Depression. Mussolini resisted all attempts to streamline the service and cut unneeded jobs. Thus, a large part of the executive was largely non-fascist. They joined the PNF when it became compulsory to do so in 1933, but largely kept going in their traditional ways. The legacies of the fascist civil service extended to the modern day. Post-war Italy inherited an inefficient and Byzantine bureaucracy. However, cutting jobs or even purging the civil service would have been political suicidal in a period when Republican Italy was trying to win hearts and minds. To this very day, the civil service reforms remain a top priority, another legacy of fascism. The state that was born from the fascist takeover was one born of the ideals of totalitarianism. The fascists certainly achieved the strong state by giving it extra powers. However, these extra powers are not necessarily given to fascist institutions, but ones hailing from the past that fascism apparently so deeply hated. The fascist state was not fascisticized. In fact, the fascist institutions were largely cast away from power. The PNF was denied any role in state building, as were the militia. Yes, the Grand Council existed, but most of the powers relegated to Mussolini, and all the state institutions under him. The old institutions remained intact, and fascism did all it could to protect these institutions from itself and other forces. The monarchy and its influence lived on, and when Mussolini died, it would be the monarch who would choose his successor. The strong state thus presented a continuity with the state that came before it. It was an authoritarian version of the liberal state. While it consolidated Mussolini's power, it would prove to be a fatal mistake for fascism. It was clear that the regime was unlikely to survive Mussolini's death. To an extent, he was the only true penetration of fascism into the state. With him gone, fascism would be in crisis. The fascist dream of a complete monopoly of power with one national fascio was already unravelling in front of them.